The Senate needs to quit fiddling around with the House bill that the president negotiated. The Senate has really, in many respects, made that bill worse. I mean, all of the new Medicaid cuts are proposed in the Senate. They weren't negotiated by the president. They weren't passed by the House. So the Senate ought to knock it off, get back on track.
Missouri members of Congress have concerns about the future of rural hospitals if the Medicaid portion of the president's budget bill is approved. But Washington is split on some aspects of the bill.
Chris Bryant is live in the newsroom with what local leaders are saying when it comes to the future of Missouri rural hospitals. Chris.
Yeah, good afternoon, Rob, Lee. They're hopeful that they can get that passed, as you heard them say just a few moments ago. However, in Missouri, lawmakers know that rural hospitals are an important part of the healthcare system in the state. In fact, for Medicaid patients in Missouri, nearly 1,275,000 people use Medicaid here in the state. Now, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, when it comes to rural America, Medicaid has covered 1 in 5 live births in the state across the country, and Medicaid also accounts for nearly 47% of all births for the year.
I'm pretty confident that we'll ultimately get it across the finish line and deliver on President Trump's key agenda items: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, making sure those tax cuts are extended. We simply can't have a $4 trillion tax increase.
Senator Eric Schmidt says families could save roughly $2,000 under the proposed bill. In addition to working through the bill, getting the funding for border security is another key aspect.
It's also priorities like making sure we have enough money for border. We have a secure border now right now for President Trump. We need to make sure that that continues, and also for deportations that need to increase.
The version of the bill currently in the Senate, according to some in Washington, is not the same bill the House passed. One of those opposed to parts of the current version is Senator Josh Hawley.
I think the attempt to defund Medicaid hospitals is a terrible idea.
And the senator is opposed to the cuts that would affect rural hospitals.
I think the idea of cutting funding to rural hospitals, I'm fighting that vigorously. We just cannot afford to close. Almost half the hospitals in Missouri are rural. We can't afford to close one of those, let alone half of them. So, there's a lot of work to do here yet, and I hope we can get it done quickly.
The Center of Healthcare Quality and Payment Reform says of the 58 rural hospitals in Missouri, 43% are at risk of closing, and 17% of rural hospitals are at immediate risk of closure. And under the bill, there is not a current provider tax.
That the reforms when it comes to Medicaid has to be waste, fraud, and abuse. That's it. The provider tax does not fall underneath waste, fraud, and abuse from my sense, and that's why it was not in the House bill. So we tried to move forward a piece of policy that mirrored the president's priorities.
In Missouri, the General Assembly passed a provider tax on the local level.
Well, you saw the provider tax passed out of the legislature this year. That's a huge piece of leverage that rural hospitals and large hospitals use to match some federal funds. House version still has that provider piece in. That's very important to us in our state, and that's a huge piece for rural hospitals.
The Congressional Budget Office, in a letter to the Budget Committee on June 12th, claimed President Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill on federal and state in-kind benefits would decrease household resources by $1 trillion, primarily in Medicaid and SNAP benefits.
Because access in rural areas is tough. Rural hospitals are struggling, and the last thing they need is something else that trips them up. So we need to be very smart. We need to be very careful in the actions that we take, that it will not harm rural hospitals that are barely making it right now.
Look, as Missouri policymakers, I can speak for myself and the other House and Senate members and other statewide leadership that we're not going to let this affect the people who actually are qualified to get the Medicaid assistance.
I reached out to members of our local legislators who work in Jefferson City to find out what their thoughts are on the proposed bill. You can read those along with statements from Mercy Hospital and Cox Health, in addition to statements from the Missouri Democratic Party, Ozarks Food Harvest, and to see the data that was presented in this story. For now in the newsroom, Chris Bryant, KY3 News.